Today we're sharing an extraordinary story of courage and justice. A simple parking ticket dispute turned into a moment that exposed deep biases within the judicial system. When a federal prosecutor stood up to a judge's unjust actions, she sparked a wave of change that went far beyond the courtroom. Stay tuned as we unravel this powerful story of standing up for what's right. The morning sun had barely risen over Atlanta's skyline when Sarah Collins's alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m. She wasn't supposed to be in court until 9:00 a.m., but years of working as a federal prosecutor had taught her the value of being prepared. Her small but elegant apartment in downtown Atlanta reflected her organized nature, with case files neatly stacked on her home office desk and her court attire always prepared the night before. Today was different, though. Sarah wasn't heading to the federal courthouse where she usually commanded respect as an assistant United States attorney. Instead, she needed to handle a simple personal matter at the municipal court. A disputed parking ticket that she believed was wrongly issued. She chose to dress more casually than usual, wearing a neat navy blue blazer over a white blouse and black pants. As she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, Sarah carefully pinned back her natural hair, which she had recently started wearing proudly after years of straightening it. At 35, her face showed the determination that had helped her graduate at the top of her class from Howard Law School and secure her prestigious position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Just a quick court appearance, she told herself, grabbing a banana and her travel mug filled with fresh coffee. A Mercedes, a recent reward to herself for winning a major corruption case, waited in the parking garage. The car was her pride and joy, though she often noticed the surprised looks from people who saw a young black woman stepping out of such an expensive vehicle. The morning traffic moved slowly through downtown Atlanta. Sarah wasn't worried. She had left plenty of time to make the 9:00 a.m. appearance. She turned on NPR, listening to the morning news while mentally reviewing her documentation for the parking ticket dispute. The ticket had been issued in a spot where the parking signs were contradictory, and she had photographs to prove it. At 8:15 a.m., her car's Bluetooth system announced an incoming call. The display showed it was from her boss, the U.S. Attorney himself. Sarah's heart rate quickened. A direct call from him usually meant something urgent. "Sarah, I apologize for the early call," her boss's voice came through the speakers. "We got a situation with the Thompson trafficking case. The defense just submitted a last-minute motion that could derail our prosecution. I need your eyes on this immediately." Sarah gripped her steering wheel tighter. The Thompson case was one of the biggest human trafficking cases in Georgia's history. "Of course, sir. What's the timeline?" "The judge has given us until noon to respond. I'm sending the documents to your email now. Can you review them and call me back with your analysis?" "Yes, sir," Sarah responded professionally, though her mind was already racing. She had planned to park at 8:30 a.m., giving herself plenty of time to find the right courtroom. Now she would need to find somewhere to pull over and review these urgent documents. Sarah managed to find a spot in a small coffee shop's parking lot. She pulled out her laptop, connected it to her phone's hotspot, and began reviewing the defense's motion. The legal arguments were complex, and she found herself taking detailed notes. Time ticked by as she analyzed each point, determined to provide thorough feedback. When she finally looked at her watch, her heart sank. It was 8:50 a.m. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away, and she knew finding parking would take time. Sarah quickly called her boss back, discussed her findings, and promised a more detailed review after her court appearance. Back in traffic, Sarah tried to stay calm. She had never been late to court before. It went against everything she stood for. But she also knew her job as a federal prosecutor came with responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. The Thompson case could affect dozens of lives, and that morning's motion could impact the entire prosecution. She finally pulled into the municipal court parking lot at 9:10 a.m. As she hurried toward the building, her phone buzzed with a thank you message from her boss, noting that her quick analysis had been extremely helpful. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. At least the delay had served an important purpose. What she didn't know, as she rushed up the courthouse steps with her documentation in hand, was that her slightly tardy arrival was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted prejudices in the very system she had dedicated her life to serving. Judge William Barrett's courtroom awaited her, and this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. Judge William Barrett's courtroom had a reputation for strict rules and cold efficiency. At 62 years old, With graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with an air of authority built over 30 years on the bench. This Monday morning, he sat elevated above everyone else, his black robe pressed and perfect, watching as people filed into his courtroom for the 9 a.m. session. The municipal courtroom was already busy. 23 people sat in the wooden benches, most of them there for minor violations, parking tickets, traffic infractions, and small disputes. Judge Barrett noticed that most of the early arrivals were white, dressed in business attire, their paperwork organized and ready. He nodded approvingly at their punctuality. "All rise," the bailiff called out at exactly 9 a.m. Judge Barrett entered his routine with practiced precision, calling the first few cases quickly and efficiently. He took pride in running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. Tardiness, in his view, was a sign of disrespect for the law itself. At 9:15 a.m., the courtroom door opened. Sarah Collins entered quietly, trying not to disturb the proceedings. But Judge Barrett immediately stopped mid-sentence during another case. His eyes narrowed at the interruption, focusing on the black woman who dared to enter his courtroom late. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice sharp and cold. The other case was temporarily forgotten. Sarah walked to the podium, her posture straight and professional despite the hostile reception. Judge Barrett looked down at his calendar. "You must be Sarah Collins, scheduled for 9 a.m. He emphasized the time, his tone dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's time, Ms. Collins?" Before Sarah could explain, Judge Barrett continued. His voice grew louder with each sentence, designed to make an example of her. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Earlier, a white businessman had arrived 5 minutes late, and the judge had barely noticed. "In this courtroom, we have rules," Judge Barrett lectured, shuffling papers on his desk without looking at Sarah. "This isn't some neighborhood gathering where you can just show up whenever you please. This is a court of law." Sarah stood calmly at the podium, her hands folded in front of her. She noticed how the judge hadn't even looked at her credentials or paperwork yet. His assumptions were written all over his face. She could see it in the way his eyes dismissed her professional attire, the way he spoke to her as if she were a child. The bailiff, an older black man named James Wilson, watched the scene with growing concern. In his 15 years in this courtroom, he had seen this pattern before. He caught Sarah's eye briefly, giving her a subtle look of understanding. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. "You may not," Judge Barrett interrupted. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergency. None of that matters here." The time was set for 9 a.m. He picked up his gavel, as if the simple presence of it would emphasize his authority. The other people waiting for their cases watched intently. A young white woman who had arrived at 9:10 a.m. sat quietly, her late arrival completely unaddressed. A pattern was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom, even if Judge Barrett himself seemed blind to it. "This court will not tolerate such disregard for procedures," Judge Barrett continued. His face had grown slightly red, his authority challenged simply by Sarah's composed demeanor. "Perhaps a fine will help you remember the importance of punctuality." Sarah stood her ground, maintaining her professional composure. She had faced prejudice before in her career. This was different. This was a clear abuse of power happening in real time, in front of witnesses, in the very system she had sworn to serve. The tension in the courtroom grew thick. Other defendants watched with a mixture of sympathy and concern. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman who had worked with Judge Barrett for years, looked increasingly uncomfortable as she typed the proceedings into her computer. What Judge Barrett didn't realize, as he prepared to announce his punishment, was that his next words would set in motion the series of events that would challenge not just his authority, but the entire system's approach to equal justice under the law. The real shock of the morning was yet to come. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face stern as he prepared to deliver his punishment. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall courtroom windows cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look even more imposing than usual. "Ms. Collins," he announced, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom, "this court hereby fines you $500 for contempt." He paused, letting the amount sink in. It was one of the highest fines he had given for tardiness this year, though he didn't mention this fact. Sarah stood perfectly still at the podium, her mind quickly noting every detail of this interaction. She observed how the judge's eyes never quite met hers, how his tone carried that particular edge she had heard too many times before in her career. As a federal prosecutor, she had developed a sixth sense for recognizing prejudice masked as authority. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, typed the fine into the computer system with hesitant fingers. She had been keeping records in this courtroom for 12 years, and something about this situation made her uncomfortable enough to create a separate note in her personal log. Just last week, a white male attorney had arrived 20 minutes late, offering no explanation, and had received only a verbal warning. Furthermore, Judge Barrett continued, seemingly encouraged by Sarah's silence, "Let this serve as a lesson in responsibility." He lifted a sheet of paper, pretending to read from it, though it was clearly just for show. The justice system functions on order and respect. Without punctuality, we have chaos. In the gallery, the other defendants watched with varying reactions. A young white woman in a business suit checked her watch, remembering that she too had arrived late but received no comment from the judge. An elderly black man shook his head slightly, having seen this scene play out too many times before. The bailiff, James Wilson, maintained his professional stance by the judge's bench, but his jaw tightened noticeably. In his 15 years of service, he had kept a mental record of such incidents, though he never spoke about them. Today's fine was significantly higher than usual, and the timing of it all seemed particularly harsh. Sarah took a slow, deliberate breath. She had handled countless cases in federal court, prosecuted dangerous criminals, and faced down hardened defense attorneys. This situation was different. It was personal. It had represented something much bigger than herself. She carefully pulled out her phone and made a quick note of the exact time and amount of the fine. Additionally, Judge Barrett added, warming to his role as disciplinarian, "You'll pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you to be late with that as well." A few nervous laughs came from the gallery, quickly silenced by the tension in the air. The morning sun had shifted now, illuminating Sarah's face as she stood at the podium. Her expression remained professional, but her eyes held a determination that would have made a wiser judge pause. She had spent years building cases, gathering evidence, and pursuing justice. Now, unwittingly, Judge Barrett was providing her with every element needed to expose systemic bias in his courtroom. "Do you understand the fine as I have explained it?" Judge Barrett asked, his tone suggesting he expected nothing but a meek acceptance. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and measured. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand completely." Each word was carefully chosen, her tone revealing nothing of her thoughts. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was to simply document everything and wait for the right moment. The judge nodded, satisfied with what he interpreted as submission to his authority. He reached for the next case file on his desk, ready to move on as if he hadn't just demonstrated exactly the kind of bias that plagued the justice system. What he failed to notice was Sarah's careful documentation of his words, his tone, and his different treatment of defendants. He didn't see her quickly type a message to her office. He was completely unaware that his next few moments of supposed authority were about to become evidence in a much larger discussion about justice and equality in the courts. The courtroom remained tense as Judge Barrett prepared to move on to the next case. But Sarah wasn't finished. In fact, she was just getting started. The next few minutes would shake the foundations of Judge Barrett's carefully controlled world, and he didn't even see it coming. The moment Sarah Collins opened her briefcase, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She pulled out a leather credential holder, its gold federal seal catching the morning light. Judge Barrett had already started to turn his attention to the next case, assuming their interaction was over. He was wrong. "Your Honor." Sarah's voice carried a new authority that made everyone in the courtroom pause. "Before we proceed, I need to properly introduce myself for the record." She held up her credentials, gold badge of the United States Department of Justice clearly visible. "I am Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins, currently serving in the Northern District of Georgia." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Judge Barrett's face, which had been flushed with authority just moments before, drained of color. His hand, reaching for the next case file, froze in midair. The courtroom fell so silent that the old ceiling fan's gentle whirring seemed suddenly loud. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The bailiff, James Wilson, couldn't help but let a small smile cross his face. He had seen many things in this courtroom, but this moment would be one he would remember for years to come. Judge Barrett started, then stopped. For the first time that morning, he actually looked at Sarah, really looked at her. He saw not just her race or gender, but her professional demeanor, her perfectly tailored blazer, and most importantly, the federal credentials in her hand. "I apologized for my tardiness this morning," Sarah continued, her voice steady and clear. "I was delayed due to an urgent federal case requiring immediate detention, the Thompson human trafficking prosecution, which I'm sure Your Honor is familiar with from the news." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I have written confirmation of this from the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I'm happy to provide to the court." The young white woman who had arrived late earlier sank lower in her seat, witnessing what felt like a scene from a legal drama. The elderly black man in the gallery sat up straighter, a look of pride crossing his face. This was something he had waited decades to see. Judge Barrett's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. Attorney Collins, I." He shuffled papers on his desk, suddenly looking much smaller in his elevated chair. "Had I known your position—" "My position," Sarah interrupted firmly but respectfully, "should not matter, Your Honor. What matters is the equal application of justice." She placed her credentials on the podium, then pulled out her phone. "I have documented several concerning patterns in this morning's proceedings, including the disparate treatment of defendants based on their race and perceived status." The judge's face shifted from pale to slightly green. As a municipal court judge, he knew exactly how much trouble a federal prosecutor's attention could bring. His mind raced back through the morning's proceedings, suddenly seeing them through new eyes. "Perhaps," he said quickly, "we could discuss this in chambers. And of course, the fine is dismissed." "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of every time she'd faced prejudice in her career. "The fine should not be dismissed simply because of my position. That would only reinforce the systemic bias I'm addressing. Instead, I believe this presents an opportunity for a broader discussion about equal treatment under the law." The other defendants in the courtroom watched in amazement. Many had their phones out, though court rules prohibited recording. This was the kind of moment they would tell their children about. The day someone finally stood up and named the inequality they had all experienced but rarely could prove. Mrs. Thompson was now typing faster than ever, determined to record every word of this historic exchange. She had seen Judge Barrett dress down countless defendants over the years, but she had never seen him face such a powerful and precise challenge to his authority. The morning sun now filled the courtroom completely, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on the stage. Judge Barrett sat in his chair, his authority crumbling around him, while Sarah Collins stood tall at the podium, transforming from a defendant into a champion of justice before everyone's eyes. The next words spoken in this courtroom would set the stage for changes that would ripple through the entire judicial system. The simple matter of a parking ticket had become something far more significant, a moment of reckoning that could no longer be ignored. The aftermath of Sarah Collins's revelation unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake in Judge Barrett's courtroom. The judge's immediate attempt to backtrack was obvious to everyone present. He shuffled papers on his desk, cleared his throat repeatedly, and adjusted his reading glasses, all signs of his growing discomfort. "Attorney Collins," Judge Barrett said, his voice noticeably softer than before, "let me be the first to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." He pressed a button to call his clerk. "We'll have this fine removed from the record immediately." Sarah remained standing at the podium, her posture straight and professional. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice firm but measured, "I respectfully decline the dismissal of the fine." Her words caused murmurs throughout the courtroom. "Instead, I would like to address the larger issue at hand." The other defendants in the courtroom sat forward in their seats. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had stopped typing entirely, her fingers frozen above her keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. The bailiff, James Wilson, moved slightly closer to the center of the courtroom, sensing the historical importance of this moment. "This morning," Sarah continued, pulling out her phone where she had been taking notes, "I observed 7 people enter this courtroom after the 9:00 a.m. start time. Of those 7, 3 were white professionals who received no comment or reprimand from the bench." She paused, letting the facts sink in. 2 were Asian students who received verbal warnings, and 2 were black individuals, myself included, who received the harshest treatment. Judge Barrett's face grew red again, but this time from embarrassment rather than authority. Now, Ms. Attorney Collins, these are very serious allegations you're making. His voice wavered slightly. I assure you that this court treats everyone equally. The evidence suggests otherwise, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. She turned slightly to address the whole courtroom. In fact, I've already sent a detailed report to my office. As an officer of the federal court, I have a duty to report any patterns of discriminatory behavior in our justice system. A young law student sitting in the back of the courtroom furiously scribbled notes. This was the kind of real-world legal drama that no textbook could teach. The elderly black man who had been watching earlier wiped a tear from his eye, remembering his own similar experiences over the decades. What exactly are you proposing? Judge Barrett asked, his judicial confidence crumbling with each passing moment. The morning sun through the windows now felt like an interrogation light on his face. Sarah placed both hands on the podium, her voice clear and purposeful. I propose 3 immediate actions, Your Honor. First, I will pay the $500 fine, not because it's just, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings. She held up a second finger. Second, I request that Your Honor review the last 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom, with a focus on demographic patterns. The judge's face paled as she continued. And third, I suggest mandatory bias training for all court personnel, including the bench. The courtroom remained silent, but the air was charged with energy. Mrs. Thompson had resumed typing, determined to capture every word of this exchange. The bailiff nodded slightly, having witnessed countless similar situations that had gone unchallenged. These suggestions, Judge Barrett began, trying to regain some control, while well-intentioned, seem rather extreme for a simple matter of tardiness. With all due respect, Your Honor, Sarah responded, what's extreme is the continuing pattern of racial bias in our courts. As federal prosecutor, I've seen how these simple matters add up to create systemic barriers to justice. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her checkbook. I'll pay the fine now, and my office will be in touch regarding the review of court records. Her voice carried no anger, no resentment, just the clear, professional tone of someone who knew exactly how to challenge injustice from within the system. The morning sun had risen higher now, illuminating the entire courtroom. Judge Barrett sat in his elevated chair, but somehow he no longer looked as imposing as he had earlier. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone present knew they were witnessing not just a moment of personal triumph, but the beginning of real institutional change. By late afternoon on the same day, the story of what happened in Judge Barrett's courtroom had spread like wildfire through Atlanta's legal community. It started with a text message from the young law student who had witnessed everything. She sent it to her study group. Just saw something incredible in municipal court. Federal prosecutor exposed judge's racial bias. You won't believe what happened. Sarah Collins sat in her federal office, reviewing documents for the Thompson trafficking case, when her phone started buzzing nonstop. First came calls from other black attorneys in Atlanta. They wanted to share similar stories about their experiences in Judge Barrett's courtroom. Many had stayed quiet for years, fearing that speaking up would harm their careers. This isn't just about me, Sarah told her colleague Marcus Johnson, another federal prosecutor who stopped by her office. For every attorney who faces this treatment, imagine how many regular citizens suffer in silence. She showed him the growing list of messages on her phone from lawyers across the city. Meanwhile, in the courthouse break room, Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, was talking to other staff members. I've been keeping my own records, she admitted, pulling out a small notebook from her desk drawer. Every time I saw something that didn't seem right, I wrote it down. Dates, names, fines, everything. Her hands shook slightly as she shared this information she had kept secret for years. By early evening, local news stations had picked up the story. A reporter named Michael Chen from Channel 5 News stood outside the courthouse, his crew setting up for the evening broadcast. Sources inside the courthouse confirmed that a federal prosecutor was fined $500 for being late to court this morning, he reported. But what happened next has sparked a citywide conversation about bias in our justice system. The story quickly spread to social media. Hashtag Judge Barrett and hashtag Justice Colorblind started trending in Atlanta. People began sharing their own experiences with the judge, and soon a clear pattern emerged. Former defendants posted about their experiences in his courtroom, many sharing similar stories of harsh treatment based on their race. Judge Barrett sat in his home that evening, watching the news coverage with growing concern. His phone had been ringing all afternoon, calls from other judges, from the Judicial Review Board, and from reporters seeking comment. He had served on the bench for 30 years, and now his entire career was under scrutiny. Sarah's office phone rang again. This time it was Sharon Martinez, a prominent civil rights attorney. "We've been trying to document these patterns for years," Sharon explained. "But coming from a federal prosecutor, especially one who experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. Would you be willing to speak at a press conference tomorrow?" In the municipal court's filing office, clerks were already pulling records of Judge Barrett's previous cases. The staff whispered among themselves as they noticed the patterns in his fines and sentences. One clerk found that over the past year, black defendants were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines in his courtroom than white defendants for the same violations. By nightfall, national news organizations had picked up the story. "Atlanta judge faces scrutiny after fining federal prosecutor," read one headline. "Racial bias in Georgia courtroom exposed," read another. Social media lit up with discussions about systemic racism in the justice system, with Sarah's experience serving as a powerful example. The bailiff, James Wilson, received several calls from other court officers that evening. "We all saw things," he told them. "But this time, someone with power saw it too, and she didn't let it slide." He thought about all the times he had watched similar scenes play out, feeling helpless to stop them. Late that night, Sarah sat in her home office, reviewing the hundreds of messages she had received. Legal organizations wanted her to speak at their events. Civil rights groups asked for her help in documenting other cases. Law schools requested her to give guest lectures about standing up to systemic bias. She opened her laptop and began typing a formal complaint to the Judicial Qualifications Commission. This wasn't just about one judge or one incident anymore. It had become something much bigger, a catalyst for change in a system that desperately needed it. As she worked, her phone buzzed with one more message. It was from a young black law student. "Thank you for showing us that we can fight the system from within. You've given us hope." 1 week after the incident, the State Judicial Qualifications Commission launched a formal investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct. The large conference room on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building buzzed with activity as investigators pored over thousands of court records from the past 5 years. Linda Martinez, the lead investigator with 20 years of experience, spread dozens of files across the long wooden table. Her team had been working nonstop, analyzing every case that had come through Judge Barrett's courtroom. The patterns they discovered were impossible to ignore. "Look at these numbers," Linda said to her team, pointing at a spreadsheet on her laptop. In traffic violation cases, black defendants paid an average fine of $450, while white defendants paid $150 for the same offenses. She pushed her glasses up and sighed. And that's just the beginning. Down the hall, in a small interview room, Mrs. Thompson sat nervously with her personal notebook in front of her. For 12 years, she had kept detailed records of every concerning incident she witnessed in Judge Barrett's courtroom. Now, she finally had the chance to share them. "I noticed the pattern my first year as his clerk," she told the investigators, her hands shaking slightly as she opened her notebook. The way he spoke to people was different. His tone, his words, even the time he gave them to explain their cases, it all depended on what they looked like. The investigation spread beyond just the fine records. The team interviewed dozens of former defendants, lawyers, and court staff. James Wilson, the bailiff, provided a written statement detailing hundreds of incidents he had witnessed over his 15 years of service. Some days, James wrote in his statement, "I would count how many times the judge interrupted black defendants compared to white ones. The difference was shocking. Black defendants were interrupted an average of 5 times more often." Meanwhile, at the federal courthouse, Sarah Collins continued her regular work prosecuting cases, but her office had become a gathering point for people wanting to share their stories. Young lawyers brought in records of their experiences, and community activists provided documentation of complaints that had been ignored for years. "We need to organize all this information," Sarah told her assistant, looking at the growing pile of evidence on her desk. "Every story matters. Every incident counts. This is bigger than just one judge. It's about changing the whole system." The investigation team discovered more troubling patterns. Black women received the highest fines on average. Cases involving minority defendants took 40% less time to process. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for minorities. Character witnesses were interrupted more frequently when speaking for minority defendants. Judge Barrett was called in for questioning multiple times. Each session revealed more about his unconscious biases. When shown the data, he appeared genuinely shocked, having never realized the extent of his discriminatory behavior. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he said during one interview, his voice quieter than his usual courtroom tone. "I never thought. I didn't realize." For the first time, he seemed to understand the impact of his actions. The investigation also uncovered an unexpected detail. Several other judges in the district showed similar patterns in their rulings. What started as an investigation into one judge's conduct had unveiled a systemic problem that reached far beyond one courtroom. By the end of the 3rd week, Linda Martinez and her team had compiled a comprehensive report. The document was 300 pages long, filled with statistics, testimonies, and detailed analysis of thousands of cases. The evidence was overwhelming. "This report doesn't just show isolated incidents," Linda had explained to the commission board. "It reveals a pattern of systemic bias that has affected thousands of lives over many years." She placed the thick report on the boardroom table. And more importantly, it shows how this bias operates so quietly that even those perpetuating it might not be fully aware of their actions. As the investigation neared its conclusion, one thing became crystal clear. Sarah Collins's experience had cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for decades. Behind it lay years of documented bias, discrimination, and unequal treatment, all waiting to be exposed and addressed. The question now wasn't just about what would happen to Judge Barrett. It was about how to fix a system that had allowed such bias to flourish unchecked for so long. The next steps would require more than just disciplinary action. They would demand a complete reimagining of how justice was served in their courts. 3 months after Sarah Collins walked into Judge Barrett's courtroom, the face of justice in Atlanta had begun to change. The morning sun shone through the windows of the main courthouse as workers installed a new sign, Center for Judicial Education and Equality Training. Judge Barrett was no longer on the bench. After the investigation's findings, he had been given a choice: resign or face a public hearing. He chose resignation. That wasn't the end of his story. In an unexpected turn of events, he had become part of the solution. "I never saw my own bias," Judge Barrett told a room full of judges during the first mandatory training session. He stood at the podium, looking different from the man who had once fined Sarah Collins. His voice was humbler, his posture less rigid. "I thought being fair meant treating everyone the same way, but I never stopped to examine how my own background and assumptions affected my decisions." Sarah sat in the back of the training room, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't expected this outcome when she stood up in that courtroom 3 months ago. Next to her sat Mrs. Thompson, a former court clerk who had been promoted to head a new court monitoring program. The changes spread far beyond one courthouse. New rules required all courts to keep detailed records of fines, sentences, and judicial conduct. These records were now reviewed monthly by an independent committee that included community members, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. James Wilson, the bailiff, had been appointed to lead a new training program for court officers. "We're the eyes and ears of the courtroom," he told his first class of trainees. "It's our duty to speak up when we see unfair treatment. The old days of staying quiet are over." In her federal prosecutor's office, Sarah looked at the wall where she had hung her $500 fine receipt in a frame. It had become a symbol of change, reminding everyone who visited her office that one person's stand could make a difference. Below it hung a new photo of her with a group of law students. She now taught a weekly class on ethics and bias in the legal system. The local bar association had created a new reporting system for lawyers to document instances of bias. In its first month, the system received over 200 reports. Each one was investigated thoroughly, creating a clear picture of where problems existed and how to address them. "It's not just about punishing bad behavior," Sarah explained to a reporter during an interview. It's about changing the way we think about justice. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their race, gender, or background. The changes weren't limited to Atlanta. Other cities began adopting similar reforms. Mandatory bias training for all court personnel. Regular audits of judicial decisions to check for racial disparities. Community oversight committees to review court practices. New guidelines for standardizing fines and sentences. Required diversity training for law school students. One morning, exactly 3 months after the incident, Sarah received a letter. It was from the young law student who had witnessed everything that day in court. The student wrote about how that moment had changed her career path. She was now focusing on civil rights law. "You showed me that change is possible," the letter read. "That sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" The student had started a legal clinic at her law school to help people who face discrimination in court. The elderly black man who had been in court that day came back to visit the courthouse. He walked slowly through the halls, looking at all the changes. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. A help desk offered free legal guidance. The security guard smiled and greeted everyone equally. "I've been coming to this courthouse for 40 years, he told a young clerk at the help desk, his eyes filling with tears. "This is the first time I felt like justice might really be blind." Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. The Judicial Review Board wanted her to head a new commission on court reform. As she read the message, she thought about that morning 3 months ago. One small moment of standing up for what was right had started a wave of change that was still growing. In the main courthouse lobby, a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Justice is not just about the law. It's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below these words was the date. The day Sarah Collins walked into Judge Barrett's courtroom and changed everything. The story of Sarah Collins shows us the power of standing up against injustice, no matter how small the moment may seem. It's a reminder that courage and determination can challenge deep-seated biases and spark meaningful change. Her actions teach us that fighting for fairness and equality is not just a duty, but a responsibility we all share. If this story inspired you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories. Thank you for watching.